Good morning. Welcome to the 6th Around the World Conference organized by the Cool Institute for Advanced Study at the University of Alberta. My name is Geoffrey Rockwell. I'm the director of the Cool Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this new version of the Around the World Conference that's going to take place over this week. I'd like to start by acknowledging we here at the University of Alberta in Edmonton are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose territories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. This Around the World Conference is dedicated to sustainable research. The Cool Institute has been organizing these conferences in order to experiment and model sustainable ways of moving ideas without moving people. We estimate that over the years we've saved approximately $200,000 Canadian and 300 metric tons of CO2. This year we thought we would explicitly tackle the topic of sustainable research practices. In this, we have been inspired by the UC Santa Barbara Nearly Carbon Neutral Conference led by Ken Hiltner and his colleagues. This year's conference is being run a little bit differently from those in the past. Instead of one long day, we're running it over a week in 2-hour blocks, which at least here in Alberta will be approximately in the middle of the day. We hope this makes this more accessible for those of you who are trying to both attend this conference, listen in, and hold down other types of tasks that you're working on. There's a few people I want to thank before we start the day's proceedings. I want to thank, first of all, Oliver Rossier, who has been with me on this fabulous experiment since the very beginning. He is really one of the motivating forces behind this conference. Adam Dombavari, the program coordinator of the Cool Institute, deserves all sorts of praise for his quiet and extremely efficient management and organization. Chelsea Mia is the project manager, and she's the person who has really taken the lead on contacting and working with people and imagining this year's Around the World Conference. Claire Peters and Grant Wang are our always unflappable technicians and who have proved themselves masters of this medium. The Office of Sustainability we've partnered with, and I draw your attention to this pamphlet on how to run e-conferences that we've put together with them, or they put together with us, especially if you're at the University of Alberta. This has all sorts of advice and contacts, but it probably applies elsewhere too. We're blessed to be here at the eHub, or the Entrepreneurs Center, and I'd like to thank them for hosting us, and of course the Faculty of Arts that's provided all sorts of support and continues to support us. I'd like you to think about this Around the World Conference is not something that you simply have to watch passively. We've made sure that it is being live streamed, and you have both the ability to tweet, and the tweets that have the hashtag will show up on the side there, and you can write comments in the bottom. So I encourage people to enter into the dialogue, and we will have people who are paying attention and can try to respond to you if you have questions and so on. So think of this as an attempt to make it more dialogical. So now I'd like to introduce the chair of our first discussion, and today's topic is sustainability in practice, revolutionary ideas to change how we live and learn. And the chair of this first discussion is Professor Naomi Krogman, former Director of Sustainability Scholarship and Education out of the Provost's office here at the University of Alberta. Over to you.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I'm very pleased to be part of this innovative conference, and I really think this will be the wave of the future. So it's my pleasure to be the first person to introduce our first speaker for the conference, Erika Daley. She is the program manager of My Green Lab. Erika manages My Green Lab's programs throughout North America, including the Green Lab Certification Program and the Green Chemistry Curriculum Guide. She has garnered experience in the design, implementation, and management of Green Lab's programs in companies and universities throughout the US and Canada. The point is for these labs to deliver safer, more efficient research and teaching spaces with a lower environmental impact. Originally from Nova Scotia, Canada, Erika holds a BSc First Class Honours with distinction from Mount Allison University, followed by an NSERC-supported MSc in Chemistry from the University of Toronto. She has also served as the co-chair of the Green Chemistry Initiative at the University of Toronto and as an executive member of the Women in Chemistry group. Erika, I'm pleased to have you speak.
So I was just saying thank you so much for that kind introduction, and I'm really excited to be here and speaking with you guys today and everyone around the world. The topic of today's discussion that I would like to start with is creating sustainable labs. So this is the focus at my Green Lab. And we were, just a little bit of background about us, we were founded in 2013 in California as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And our mission is quite broad, but it is to build a culture of sustainability through science. And so we do this through a few different programs. The first is our Green Labs programs, which apply to academia, biotech, pharmaceutical companies, hospitals. And these programs focus on 4 main divisions, including energy, water, green chemistry, and end-of-life disposal, which includes waste, recycling, and compost. Some examples of successful initiatives within each of these is our energy initiatives, which we have a Be Good in the Hood initiative to promote safer, more efficient use of fume hoods, and a -70 is the new -80 initiative, which is an ultra-low temperature freezer chill-up campaign. Our water recommendations, we recommend the installation of water-saving devices on autoclaves, including things like water misers, elimination of single-pass cooling by installing closed-loop systems. And not only are these more sustainable, but they can also prevent flooding, which I think we can all appreciate the extent of damage that are associated with those types of accidents, and therefore preventing them. We also focus on promoting green chemistry and using things like amphibian bromide alternatives, eliminating the use of mercury, and green chemistry through education. We recently launched a green chemistry guide, and I'll talk more about that in a few moments. And of course, most lab supplies, chemicals, and equipment have an end of life and need to be disposed of, which isn't always an easy task. So we work with companies and universities to increase waste diversion and reduction opportunities. And we also work with vendors to create or expand any take-back recycling programs that they have. So the implementation of Green Labs programs has realized really massive savings in all of these categories. And most of the programs go far beyond sustainability. Implementing best practices in each of these categories make labs a safer place to work, and it also helps them to operate in a more cost-effective manner. All of these initiatives and more are recognized through our Green Lab certification program. There are 14 categories. They're all listed here in just a quick screenshot of our website. And they acknowledge everything from water usage habits and inventory management to travel and community involvement. And so just because your lab uses chemicals doesn't mean it can't be sustainable. I also wanted to recognize one example of a Canadian partnership that we have. So we work with Green Centre Canada to use the My Green Lab assessment tool that we use in our certification program to quantify the impact of labs in Ontario and work with them on specific sets of recommendations to reduce their environmental footprint. And I really think by taking this on as a province, there's such a potential to have a huge impact and realize substantial positive change in terms of safer and more sustainable lab spaces. So My Green Lab launched the Center for Energy Efficient Labs in 2014 to help make financial incentives for energy efficient labs and equipment a reality. One example is the ultra-low temperature freezers, or otherwise known as -80s, which we're working to help make known as -70s. These are typically used to store very important samples and sometimes contain the entire life's work of scientists. They do consume a tremendous amount of energy. And so in order to encourage the market to shift towards more energy efficient options, we work with the Center for Energy Efficient Laboratories to undertake a project to have these ultra-low temperature freezers included in Energy Star ratings. And so now you can see, I just pulled this local example from our San Diego rebates catalog. We now have these deemed rebates for high efficiency ultra-low temperature freezers. And this program has spread throughout the state of California, and we're hoping these models will be used to create rebates from utility companies across North America. Another program we have is the ACT label. There is really a huge opportunity to reduce the environmental impact of labs through smarter purchasing. And the ACT label is the first of its kind eco-nutrition label, we like to think of it as, for lab products. And this includes consumables, chemicals, and equipment. And so by emphasizing ACT and the accountability, consistency, and transparency around manufacturing, the impact the user can have and the end of life, this label makes it really easy to choose safe and sustainable products and compare apples to apples. So if you're trying to buy a water bath, for example, and there's two that are labeled as green, this label would really make that a lot more clear to the person purchasing that water bath why each one is green, or the different impacts that they both have in each of the categories. Be sure to check it out before making your next purchase. All of the ACT labels are on the ACT website, so you can actually look at them before you're making a purchase. They're not just on the consumables or the equipment that you might be purchasing, so that you would look at them after. And then finally, I just wanted to mention, with our partners Beyond Benign and Sigma, we recently launched a guide to green chemistry experiments for undergraduate organic chemistry labs. And this guide has 10 complete experiment packages that have experimentals, comparison of traditional versus green or alternative experiments, a TA guide, example quiz questions. And the other thing I wanted to point out is on top of those packages, we really put a lot of work into the introduction of the guide, which has a thorough explanation of how the ratings and comparisons were carried out and how the general green chemistry resources that apply to both research and teaching labs can be used, such as solvent selection guides, reagent selection guides. We've put a Green Chemistry 101 section in there, so everyone can kind of nail down the basics and educate themselves. And just really the top points of what they need to know, whether that's for teaching or whether that's just an intro that they want to use to kind of guide where they're learning further. And then also, I wanted to point out that this is a free resource for everyone to download and use. You can find it on our website, mygreenlab.org, under the Green Chemistry section. And we really do truly appreciate feedback on how this has helped you, how you have implemented it, and any new experiments or resources that you might like to see in future editions of this guide. This feedback is really, really important to make it possible for us to create additional guides like this. So please email us or fill out a form on our website if you've downloaded it and used it and you really appreciated the resources that are included. And so finally, just to wrap up, after 5 years, our impact has been really profound, and we're really proud of all the organizations making efforts towards more sustainable labs that we've been able to help and provide support and resources to. We've reached over 10,000 scientists every year with our programs, and we've created the first North America green certification for labs. We've certified over 100 labs in the US and over 20 in Canada. And like I was saying, achieved Energy Star ratings for -20 or -80 freezers, and we're now working on -20 freezers. And we've helped save several million kilowatt hours in energy consumption, millions of gallons of water, and also helped divert several hundred pounds of waste. And so here's our website, our Twitter handle. We also have Facebook and LinkedIn, and my email if you have any questions or would like to contact me about any of the things I mentioned. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Erika. It's really exciting, the work that you're doing. Congratulations. I want to just ask you a few questions with the 10 minutes or so that we have. I'm wondering if you think about informing people who are designing labs from the very initial stage. What kind of advice would you give to avoid some of the sort of retrofitting and after-the-fact fixes that you have also come up with?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. So, there are a number of guides that people have created, which is fantastic. We've actually helped create one with the University of California system. So for a detailed explanation, I guess, of how to design labs from the very beginning and all the kind of ideal dream world situation that you could think of, there are definitely guides that exist that go into detail. But a few of the really important things that I can point out there are closed loop water reuse systems, and actually there at the University of Alberta at the French campus, I believe. I met one of the professors that created a really awesome closed loop water system for her teaching lab to avoid using any single pass cooling condensers in a chemistry lab. So definitely closed loop water reuse systems, and once again to avoid flooding of the single pass cooling. Large windows for natural light with appropriate coatings, of course, to control heat, because then that becomes an issue. One of the best things I think we could recommend is smart HVAC systems, so heating, ventilation, cooling systems. And you can get these designed now with chemical sensors to optimize the air exchange rates, because that's where we see a lot of technology coming up these days. In terms of sustainability and how to keep labs safe with their air control rates, but also make them a lot more sustainable. Another big one is something called chilled beams. And these allow for the ventilation requirements to be decoupled from heating and cooling loads. And then, of course, with that, you can extend that to high quality insulation. I think that's also underrated a lot of times. And then some smaller things like LED lighting and recycled materials whenever possible, like flooring, furniture, metal, things like that. So yeah, those are, I think, the biggest things that we could point out.
Okay, I also want to ask you about how you would educate people who run labs, high school teachers who run labs, university lab managers, university professors. What are some of the fundamental things that you wish they would understand when they set up their lab and as they oversee what their lab purchases and how they manage their lab?
I think that my biggest thing is that sustainability is often seen as a barrier, and I think the biggest thing that I would like to see is people seeing it as a tool to make their lab safer and more efficient and more cost effective. Labs, just to put it out there, use about 5 times more energy per square foot than offices. And so I think designing teaching labs around that, and also all of the design and hard work that people go into creating teaching labs, I think is not always said when they're teaching the class or when they're writing up the manuals for students. So creating test questions or quiz questions, or even bringing it up in a lecture, like the previous experiments or traditional experience the way that things used to be done or maybe still are being done, and then asking students how they might improve it, or kind of using it as a tool to teach and to bring about some of these changes that we're trying to bring about overall, but really showing students that this is something that they're working on and how things maybe used to be or how they could be.
So what are your blue sky ideas for the future of your company?
Ideally, we would love to see a day where we don't need to exist anymore, where labs, the way that science is being done and the way that people are being educated is done all sustainably, and that people don't really have a choice, that it's just a consideration and it's the underlying fundamental values that everything is built on. So I think overall that's kind of the big term, long-term goal for our organization. But I think more recently and in the shorter-term goals, like I was saying, through our certification program, and we definitely work with different companies and universities on an individual basis to help their sustainability or H&S departments and facilities management, and directly with professors and students to green their labs or the spaces that they're working in, their research spaces. So I think our shorter term goals are any resources that we can provide around those.
what would you say are the main pillars of sustainability or the principles that you would like to advance overall from your company's perspective?
Primarily, we focus on the four main ones that I mentioned at the beginning. So energy, water, waste, and green chemistry. And I think if you think about different projects in terms of those four categories, you can pretty much cover everything in the lab. And it also breaks down projects very easily into kind of bite-sized pieces, so it doesn't seem overwhelming that you need to green your whole lab. And I think that bringing those all together, that's when you can see change, when you focus on those individually as projects, but then when you look at them all together and bring them together in a holistic manner, that's when you see these programs really start to take shape and make really substantial changes.
So Erika, I want to ask you one last question.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I see a lot of what you're doing is you're incentivizing and you're providing a pathway for people to green their labs in all aspects. Do you see any policy changes that you would recommend to help guide that behavior even more directly? Because as it stands now, you're working with only, and it's most important, the voluntary actions that can be taken. Do you see a role for regulation or policy to also help what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is ultimately where things will hopefully end up, is that we're going to see things like carbon neutrality policies. The Green Center partnership is through the carbon tax from Ontario, the government of Ontario. So I think that once a lot of these programs are also very new and it's still in their infancy. And so I think once they're a lot more established and once the government, hopefully sooner than later, realize the potential impact from some really simple changes that can be made, that hopefully a lot of these will go into policy. And I think we're seeing some of that already with, like I was saying, carbon neutrality policies, zero waste policies, clean city policies. In order for any of those, and it's maybe not direct, but in order for any of those to actually take shape, labs really do need to be addressed because they produce a lot of waste. They consume a lot of resources, including energy and water. And so I think we're starting to see some of that indirectly already, but I think there is a huge potential for that, and that it definitely will be coming in the future, hopefully.
All right. Well, Erika, I applaud what you're doing, and thank you so much for being part of this. This is the way labs are run is a huge part of sustainability at universities, and you're really helping provide a pathway for people to do that. So thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, if there's any questions or comments further, we're always happy to take those by email or phone later on. So thank you guys so much for having me, and best of luck with the rest of your conference.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask Bill Shotyk to join us. Just to remind you, we are at a session on sustainability in practice, revolutionary ideas to change how we live and learn. For the next portion of our program, we're also going to talk to someone that thinks about green chemistry and other ways of reducing the chemical impact to our environment and beyond that. But there are going to be two speakers for this next half hour. One person, Dr. Shotyk, is going to sort of be the interviewer with Dr. Palmer. So I want to introduce both of these people to you, and then I'll turn it over to Bill. So Bill Shotyk is a professor in renewable resources in the Faculty of Agriculture, Life Sciences, and the Environment. He's also a Bocock Chair in Agriculture and Environment. Bill is committed to sustainability and what he teaches, researches, and how he lives his life. He has published more than 200 articles for which he has won a number of prestigious awards. He has also, over the past 40 years, with the help of family and friends, planted over 25,000 trees of 50 different species on his family farm property near Elmvale, Ontario. Bill will be talking with Paul Palmer for the next half hour. Paul Palmer is the founder and director of the Zero Waste Institute and author of a book, Getting to Zero Waste. After earning his PhD in chemistry from Yale, teaching in Turkey, Copenhagen, and Indianapolis, and performing Turkish dances and picking up a master's in folklore, Paul started a company called Zero Waste Systems Incorporated. The company flourished, finding homes for hundreds of tons of excess chemicals that would otherwise be buried in the ground. Paul has promoted the principle of this company of reuse and continued ownership to all goods. His institute, the Zero Waste Institute, attempts to flesh out this principle in all applications. Getting to Zero Waste is a manual for chemical brokerage and reuse. So it is a pleasure to have Bill and Paul here. Bill?
Thanks very much, Naomi. Paul, it's a pleasure to finally get to meet you. We had some contact way back when. As you know, I'm a great fan of what you're doing. So, Paul, if I can ask you for the audience to start, just to explain first, what is the concept of zero waste?
Zero waste, as I see it, is a design principle, as it says on the chart behind me. I don't really believe in nibbling at the edges and trying to work with reducing garbage slightly, which is what most of the zero waste organizations around the world are doing. I really believe that we can redesign all goods, and I proved it with chemicals, so that they are built from the get-go for perpetual use. And perpetual means, well, very long term. It turns, when you think about it, when you apply your intelligence to how you would do such a thing, it turns out to be much easier than you might imagine if you've never even thought about it. But a lot of people dismiss it in about a microsecond, saying, oh, you can't design for perpetual use. Well, they're quite wrong. And to prove it, I do maintain a website, the zerowasteinstitute.org. On the website, I have a lot of projects that I work out as to how you could redesign goods to be perpetually reused. It's an involved process getting started, but it's actually simple. A lot of it depends on using principles like standardization and modularization. That's difficult to design for long-term use and reuse over and over again. I've done that with many of these projects. You can find it on the website under the heading projects, and you'll find a whole bunch of possibilities worked out.
Paul, one of the things I wanted to ask about is specifically in your view, which jurisdictions have achieved zero waste? So what is the status of zero waste, and who is already there?
Virtually no one that has achieved zero waste, as I envision it, through redesign of goods for long, very, very long lives, perpetual lives. There are some places that have made some first approaches. Like, for example, airplanes are not allowed to fall out of the sky, so they design those fairly well for a pretty long life. They replace the parts and keep them going for many years. Software designers have an interesting intersection with zero waste because they have to design so that pieces of the software that they write can be used by other people later on. So they have what they call object-oriented programming, where they make modules that can be used by other programmers. And the thing I like about that is that, or that fits right into a zero waste framework, because important work that takes up resources, the resources of people living and educating their children and driving cars and all. It takes up all those resources, and they're made available for perpetual reuse. But the recyclers have nothing to say about this because there are no materials. What's important is not what gets put down on some paper or on a CD disc. It's all really mental. It's intellectual. And from a zero waste point of view, it makes perfect sense. But from a recycling point of view, they just don't know what to do with it.
Paul, you've mentioned aircraft industry as a sort of geochemist, I've certainly admired some of the metals and alloys that go into the construction of aircraft. It's certainly impressive. And some of these are very high energy alloys, titanium alloys and so on. So you mentioned the aircraft industry as a leader. Are there any municipalities working toward zero waste? And in your view, where are the municipal leaders in terms of zero waste?
Robert Krause, who lives up there in Canada with you guys, he wrote a thesis at Lincoln University in New Zealand a couple of years ago. What he did was he started out looking around at all of the municipalities and other groups that are trying for something that they call zero waste to landfill, which is kind of a crazy name. But anyway, what they mean is that they can do 100% recycling and nothing will ever have to be treated as garbage. He started out, as I recall his story, he started out thinking, well, he would just do a report about these various projects. And when he began looking at them more closely, he realized that there aren't any. There are no successes whatsoever in any of the fields. There have been hundreds of attempts, but not one of them was a success on its own terms if it had run the period that was assigned to it. And then he realized that the whole concept is an exercise in predictable failure. He looked at Toronto and somewhere else, and then he also looked at San Francisco. Now, San Francisco, a city that just likes to pat itself on the back about being progressive and forward, they have what they call a zero waste to landfill recycling program, and they have a lot of the original recyclers around pushing them and promoting them. And it's on its way to becoming a total failure, like every other municipality has experienced a failure. San Francisco looks desperately around for places to ship garbage to. That's what it really comes down to. They're not going to be recycling everything. And even if they did recycle the things that are in their garbage cans, it would be a success of no value whatsoever, because recycling does not deal with the issue of waste. Waste occurs when you create shoddy products over and over and over again in expensive factories that use up lots of resources, labor resources, air, water, energy resources, and you make products over and over again in those factories because they've been designed to self-destruct after a year or two or a short life. That's where the waste occurs, and that's where the resources are really wasted. When you actually take, let's say, your smartphone or whatever it is here, and if you toss it into a garbage can and it goes into a dump, that's completely unimportant. That's not waste. The waste already occurred when a poorly made product was designed to collapse and fail after a short life. That's a very important distinction that the recyclers don't get. Well, of course, it's in the recycler's interest to pretend that the waste occurs when you actually put something into a garbage can, because then they can take it out and smash it up and get a few pieces of glass or steel or copper out of it. So it's worth it to them to push the notion that waste occurs when you actually throw something away, but it doesn't. It's too late by then. The waste has already occurred. And what we've got to do is stop making products over and over and over again for short lives. We have to start making products that have interchangeable parts, that are standardized, that are modularized. And that's not going to be easy, because in the United States, the only thing that counts is the profit motive. And if you can make a profit making crap, well, go ahead. The government will support you all the way. There's an uproar in Congress against any kind of regulation, which is coming to a head right now. But without some kind of oversight of how things are designed and what kinds of lives they're going to lead, we will never be able to get rid of the dumps and the recycling and all of those other wasteful end of life, end of pipe fixes.
So, Paul, this is a very important point, and I know it's missed on a lot of people. So here in the city of Edmonton, we pride ourselves in our recycling program, composting program. Last time I heard, the mayor of Edmonton, this is a few years ago on our national radio program, mentioned the city of Edmonton working toward 96% diversion. So that's diversion away from the landfill. So recycling, composting, and also energy recovery. So Paul, as you've pointed out, that's not zero waste. So a lot of these recycled materials, I'm thinking very specifically of plastic, polyethylene terephthalate, so PET bottles, like the throwaway water bottles. And municipalities across Canada have been recycling those, and they go off to China for recycling, and they come back in the form of clothing, fleece jackets and so on. But now China's saying, no thanks, we don't want any more of that plastic. So municipalities in Canada, they're having to deal now with what do we do with this plastic that we're recycling. So I want to ask you very specifically, what policies do you think need to be changed to, I don't want to say make zero waste a more common approach, but to introduce zero waste in the way that you've defined it? What can our municipalities, what can they do to move in this direction of true zero waste?
One thing they could do is to stop trying to promote recycling. Recycling is sold as a religion. You can look in academic journals, you won't find any support or any analysis of recycling or any of its successes, because really there aren't any. Recycling has been sold as it's a scam promoted by the garbage industry. They love recycling. Now, you know, the garbage industry has a reputation of being pretty ruthless. They don't promote anything that's going to deprive them of profits. We know that waste management especially has a pretty shady background, which they've long struggled to overcome. They're pretty well focused on the bottom line. Yet if there's a recycling congress or conference, the garbage industry will be right there buying a table and giving out a grant. And then they run recycling centers all around the country. Recycle America is a subsidiary of Waste Management. I believe that's true. Why would the garbage industry be so eager to support recycling? Well, the reason is that recycling serves as a surrogate for promoting garbage generation. The more recycling you have, as a rule, the more garbage gets generated, because people just have the feeling, well, I don't have to worry about it anymore. I define garbage as that which you don't want to think about, as that material stuff that you just prefer not to think about. So you turn it over to a third party, which in most cases would be a garbage company, and you assume that they'll take responsibility now, which doesn't happen. It's a silly notion, but anyway, that is the reigning notion. The garbage companies know this. They discovered after battling recycling when it first appeared in the late 60s, they battled it for a while, and then they realized this was a real gift from the environmentalists, because all of a sudden they're beginning to look green. I recount a story on my website of going to a hardware store, and the lady said, "Would you like a paper bag?" And I said, "No, that I have pockets." And she said, "Oh, it'll be recycled." In other words, make some garbage. It doesn't matter. It's going to be recycled. And this is a universal attitude. So this is why the garbage companies love recycling. So to answer your question, one of the things that could be done is to get away from this recycling madness and begin to think about the design of products. Now, there is a good example that I like. A short while ago, it was announced that the European Commission was going to redesign the chargers that are used for electronic goods in Europe. And they were going to standardize the chargers so that they all were the same and they could be interchangeable on many different computers and printers and other things. The estimate was that this simple change of standardization was going to save 50,000 tons of materials that did not have to be put into all incompatible chargers, since now people would just switch their chargers, keep their chargers when they got a new computer. That's pretty impressive. That's the kind of thing that needs to be done. Okay, so let's go back and talk about policy changes that could be done. One of the big things that a university could do, I think, well, you were talking about Edmonton. I think you have a university there. One of the big things universities could do would be to establish research departments for zero waste, how to redesign goods so that they won't be thrown away. I mean, there's a million other things I could mention, but that's a good enough start.
Paul, that takes me to my next question, innovations in design. So you've mentioned the chargers. I remember hearing a story about a guy that collects these chargers, fills up his suitcases, flies to Europe, sells them at flea markets, and that pays for his European vacation. We've got these chargers coming out of our ears, so this is why I don't buy electronics. What design innovations do you see that give us the greatest hope?
As I've said, applying standardization and modularization are some of the most important things that you can change. For example, automobile parts. Automotive manufacturers tend to be very proud of the fact that they're making their cars lightweight and they're using plastic fenders and plastic dashboards and plastic everything for the car. But they're still using the very profit-oriented yearly model approach. And so every car has a different kind of fender and a different kind of dashboard, different kind of bumper. If a car has an accident or it just gets a couple of years old, they'll put it into a scrapyard and they put it into a crusher. They take this very complex, very valuable product and they just break everything up into tiny little pieces and they think that they've accomplished something. If they were to use standardization, how about the idea that the government would allow 5 or 7 or 10 designs for fenders? You could still have a lot of variability. Let's say that you reduce the number of possible designs for automotive fenders made out of plastic, so that there would be businesses that just collected all of the fenders and just interchanged them and supplied them when a car part was needed, because they all fit each other. They don't have to fit each other 100%, but there's 10% of them that all fit each other and another 10% that work together. I made the same analysis with power tools, and you can find that on my website under projects, power tools. That would be a big start. I don't know about taking a bite of the whole cookie all at once, but I think we can begin to nibble at zero waste designs.
Well, Paul, you mentioned automobiles. I think that's a whole nother discussion when we talk about zero waste. But what I wanted to ask you about building materials, construction materials. So some of these things I know can be fully recycled, like concrete and glass and most of our metals, and some cannot. So I'm thinking about pressure-treated wood, which at least in the past was copper chromated arsenic. So in terms of our homes, for North Americans pride themselves in their homes. And Canadians, I mean, for the average Canadian family, this is the biggest investment they're ever going to make. And so Canadians like to buy homes and then spend the rest of their lives, apparently, remodeling them. My question is, with our homes, which is a big part of our environmental footprint, what can be done there on the design side to, again, approach zero waste?
There are a lot of things that can be done. And in fact, you put your finger on a great problem. Homes and buildings in general are an enormous investment that we make as a society. And we make them in perhaps the most wasteful way we can find. Everything is custom made. We have, I don't know what goes on in Canada, but I assume it's the same. We have finally standardized to 8-foot studs, 8-foot panels, 8-foot walls. But aside from that small effort at standardization, we custom make every building. We put up the drywall, we put up the studs, we put up we build the ceilings and the roofs, and they're all custom made. As a zero waste approach, that is not a very intelligent approach. What we need to do is to make modules that we can put together. For example, let's say that in a factory, we created an entire bedroom or a bathroom or a living room or all of them, and then we just assembled them. And then when it was time, when the home was no longer wanted in that spot, or for whatever reason it had to be moved, we could just disassemble these rooms. They would have built-in harnesses for their water and gas and electricity, and they would just be connected together. We would disassemble them and put them together somewhere else in different arrangements, because they would be made for maximum interoperability. We could do the same thing with shipping containers, these long steel shipping containers. There is a movement to try to use these shipping containers. They aren't made for that. They're made just for shipping with no thought in mind of a future use. What if they were made with doors and conduits and other appurtenances that they need to be used for building into living units afterwards? But usually there's no thought to an afterwards. They're just made for whatever shipping, whatever is best for shipping. So anyway, I think that buildings could be made to be standardized and modular, and that would be a tremendous boon. You know, Thomas Edison, it's not quite known that he got behind a movement like this at one time. Thomas Edison had an idea that buildings could be made out of pure concrete in one cast. And he made big molds, and his idea was to fill them with concrete, just let them set up, and then take away the molds, and there'd be a complete building. And he tried it. He ran into a problem with the settling of aggregate. He couldn't solve that problem. But at one point, Thomas Edison was the largest concrete maker or cement maker in the world. He bought so many cement companies because he was sure that this idea was going to fly. And then he just abandoned it. So it's not entirely a new idea, but I think it could be done much better today.
Paul, it's so interesting to imagine redesigning things from the start. It gives us so much opportunity as we redesign cities, given most people are moving into cities and most of the infrastructure that supports cities, you know, the bridges and the dams and that kind of thing is going to have to be rebuilt. It's really a good time to be thinking about these things you're talking about.
And I'm really glad that you think ahead in that way. So many people just don't. They just think, oh, I want to build a bridge. Whatever I have to do to build it, I'll just build it. And they don't think, well, down the road, this is going to deteriorate. We're going to have to repair it. We're going to have to do whatever comes next.
I've actually built a bridge on our little farm property in Ontario, so I do have some experience with bridge building.
Okay.
The Daley Bridge, which was developed for the military. So if you're familiar with the Daley Bridge, you can come to a stream crossing with your bridge, assemble a bridge, cross the stream, and then disassemble the bridge and use it at the next site. So the Daley Bridge is a really nice design of zero waste. And many of those old World War II bridges are still in use by logging companies and so on. So the design, as you say, Paul, was right there to be able to reuse that bridge again and again. And they've been reused for decades.
Wow, neat.
Great example.
Paul, since I'm a professor here too at University of Alberta, and I've known Bill for some time, and been very impressed with his commitment in his own approach to living and working and how he educates others, his commitment to sustainability. So I just want to give Bill a chance to also talk about if we could rethink here at the university as professors how we influence sustainable research and how we teach our classes. What are some of the trends you wish to see here at University of Alberta?
We have some amazing professors here on the campus, really an amazing collection of world-class scientists, natural scientists, social scientists, studying the environment and teaching about the environment, and that's great. I think we have to be very conscious, if this is our day job, we have to be very conscious of practicing what we preach. This event is a wonderful event because I just had to walk from one building to another to participate. I didn't have to use any fossil fuels to get here. There's an awful lot of scientists, and not just scientists, celebrities, politicians, activists, flying all around the world, telling us that we have to stop flying all around the world. If we're really as concerned about the environment as we say we are, we've dedicated our careers to this, we're teaching about this, then we have to practice what we preach. We have to demonstrate that by example.
Okay, thank you. Paul, do you have anything to say to that?
The personal impact is overemphasized in the environmental movement, at least in my field. I'm not going to speak to all the others. There is a creeping sense that the only things that really matter are the things that we consume and we put on our own bodies, like clothing and especially food. There's a big food movement. San Francisco is trying to do a recycling extravaganza and recycle everything that's in their garbage cans, but they completely ignore 95, 97% of what they actually use. They ignore all their streets, they ignore their bridges, they ignore the enormous buildings that they build, they ignore the homes. All that they focus on is what they personally come in contact with every day, which is in a garbage can. And that's just not enough. San Francisco likes to pretend that it's going to recycle 100% of what it uses. Well, it's not. It's nowhere near that. It's never going to get anywhere near that. But all they're talking about are garbage cans. If they did actually smash up and extract little insignificant materials from all their garbage cans, had no garbage cans to send to a dump, they would have worked with 3% of what they actually use. And they refuse to recognize that. They don't mention trucks or cars or the airplanes that the people use. All of these things are needed by the residents of San Francisco and are used. And you may not use a whole building all by yourself, but you are one, maybe 1,000th of the user of all the users, and you all add up, and that is a San Francisco product that has been used by San Francisco residents. And they just ignore that. Where I was heading with that is what we need are institutional responses. We need to get some organization behind zero waste approaches to actually do redesign. We need university research departments that set up a team for doing the redesign. I've been preaching this kind of approach for 40 years now. Not once in 40 years has anybody ever said, I have a project, I can think of a redesign, and this would be a way that we could reuse things perpetually. It's never happened. It has to happen intensively. Okay. And those designs have to be put out and have to end up being used to create products.
Paul, thank you so much. I completely agree with you, but I also agree with Bill. We need to set the example when we can. So thank you so much for joining us. It was great content. And thank you, Bill, for the excellent questions.
Thanks, Naomi.
Hi, I'd like to welcome people back to the Around the World Conference. It's my pleasure to chair this panel on sustainable research in the North with two great panelists. My name is Roger Epp. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta and also director of University of Alberta North, a small office that maintains a full suite of northern research and educational relationships. It's fitting that we have taken this panel north, far away from the traditional university, and to do that before we spin south in a dizzying way to the southern hemisphere. Now, just to situate our panel, and you may want to get your Google Maps ready if you are in a position to do two things at once. Along the Decho, the Mackenzie River, I'm not going to say the remote north, because for me, remote is always a loaded word. It connotes marginal, peripheral. It tells us where knowledge is located and where it's not. And also because if we take remote at its most neutral, it always needs to be qualified. In relation to what? In that case, or in which case, our two presenters actually have as close up a position on some of the most demanding, challenging research questions of our time. They have a close-up position in terms of their proximity to significant impacts of global climate change, and they have a position in between Indigenous and settler knowledge cultures. So I would say they're not remote at all, but they are northern, and it's my pleasure to welcome them. Amy Amos is based in Inuvik. She is Executive Director of the Gwich'in Renewable Resource Board, an experiment in co-management created out of a land claim settlement that involves Indigenous communities directly and bridges research and decision-making. Jean Polfus, who is upstream in Tulit'a, is a scientist, an artist, who holds currently a Liber post-doctoral fellowship. She has done fantastic work on cross-cultural research collaboration and will speak to us out of her own perspective. So here's how I'd like to proceed this afternoon. I will invite Amy and then Jean to introduce their work, say a little bit about their work setting, and I think something also about their experience of sustainability as a research challenge in their locations. I may follow up with a question or two. I'll see if they have anything to say to each other. And then I will hope that various audiences listening and watching and following by various means will join us with questions or comments. You can post questions on the website, on Twitter, on YouTube, and somehow by very low-tech means they will be conveyed to me and I will convey them to our presenters. And then we will finish at about 12:40 or so with maybe a couple of minutes on the other end of that just to make sure we get said what we need to say. So with that, I will turn to Amy to open with the presentation.
Thank you, Roger. Twin Gwinzi, which means good in my language. Before I get into my talk, hopefully the first slide is showing. My elders have always told me that I should take a moment to introduce myself before I present. So on the slide, you can see a photo of myself and my parents. I was born in Inuvik, Northwest Territories. I get my Gwich'in and Métis side from my mother. And my dad has a mixed background, but is mainly Scottish. I was born in Inuvik, but I left at a very young age, and I was raised with my father in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the East Coast, so pretty far away from Inuvik. And that's where I grew up, and I received my education. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in biology, and I worked for Fisheries and Oceans in Halifax while doing my education. I returned back to Inuvik about 12 years ago to work as one of the biologists for my current employer. So Roger alluded to the mandate of my board. I work for the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board. It is a co-management board that was established under the guidance of the Gwich'in Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement, which was signed in 1992 by government and the Gwich'in. Our mandate is to manage to be the main instrument for wildlife, fish, and forest management within the Gwich'in settlement area. The Gwich'in settlement area, I don't have a map on the slide, but it's in northwestern portion of the Northwest Territories. We have 4 communities. I'm located in the main hub, Inuvik. That's where our office is located. my role is I'm the Executive Director for the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board now. The few things that I wanted to speak to is that under our mandate, we're responsible for management of the resources. Part of that is to do research. So we do have biologists on staff that do research themselves, but we also work with researchers and to determine what research should be done. We work directly with the communities. My office does have a small bit of money that they can contribute to research to determine the best way to focus our time and resources and financial contributions and letters of support. We created a process. So every 5 years, there's a workshop. We just held our second one last September in Ağalık. At this workshop, we do sort of like a research gap analysis, look at all past research interests that have been forwarded to us, and the board has some criteria that they developed that directly relates to their mandate, and they come up with their internal 5-year priorities that they want to focus their staff time, their money, and collaboration efforts on. But on an ongoing basis, our staff are constantly in the communities, constantly working with individuals, harvesters, and community members. And regardless if we're at a meeting to directly talk about research, a lot of times research questions that they have come up in those meetings. So we try our best to record those. And that's why I would say that data collection of research interest is ongoing. And then the board has 2 face-to-face meetings a year. In the fall, they would look at their 5-year priorities and make any adjustments for anything that might be emerging and may not have been considered at the previous workshop. And then in the winter, they make project decisions and work plan decisions, and then that kind of feeds into the annual cycle. Because data collection is ongoing, you can imagine that we hear all interests, so not all of them are related to the GRB's mandate. The ones that are related to our mandate, the types of support we can offer are partnerships and collaboration, financial support, helping with youth involvement if we're directly involved, but we could also provide youth names if researchers are interested in having youth involvement. We can provide in-kind support, equipment sharing, letters of support, and advice. If it's unrelated to the GRB's mandate, it's still related to a community interest, and we can share the contact information of who provided that recommended interest, and we can still provide advice. This, to me, I think is kind of leads to the question Roger mentioned about sustainable research in the North, because in the North, I think we are a little bit different than Southern. Just from my personal experiences from working in the East Coast, I think when I moved to the North, one of my first observations was that a lot of the research that we're doing is core research relating to baseline data collection. One of our main objectives is to try to have research whenever possible done so that it's leading towards community-based monitoring, so helping to train our people so that they can collect that information and be contributing to that process. This diagram is something that I came up with, and it's my personal recommendations for best practices, having dealt with researchers over the different years. And in summary, basically what I suggest is that I think researchers need to have an ongoing conversation with organizations like ours, but also with the community people directly involved with their work. And that starts at the question stage. So for us, since we have in our region a process for identifying research interests, we have that information available. It's not always available in the same format in other regions, but for us in the Gwich'in area, we do have that, so we can help by providing that information to help formulate questions that are directly related to questions the communities and our organization are looking at having answered. And then including us in the design phase, so we can offer information on how to answer the question, how we can help with local advice. For example, maybe a site that is difficult to access or needs to be avoided during different times of the year. And then licensing stage is generally when we're first contacted by researchers, when they need to get approvals for doing research in our area. My suggestion is that if you've already contacted us through the question stage and design phase, the licensing phase may be less cumbersome. And then through the methods, we suggest hiring locally whenever possible, but also to stop by the offices, talk with us, meet the people, participate in community events if they're going on while you're here, and also getting into the schools to educate our youth, because they are our future managers of our land, and they have a lot of input and knowledge too, and interest. And then at the analysis stage, totally understand that for this part, it's really hard to do that in the community. A lot of times it has to be outside, but to do periodic check-ins. And I think in the theme of sustainability, I think there's a lot of ways through social media and radio and other means that you can provide interim reports. And even though you don't have final results, there's still ways that you can keep that conversation going. And then for the results, ideally, what I hear from communities and people directly is that they really want to see the person come back and deliver those results in person. What I've seen really effective, if you've established strong community relationships and you've worked directly with individuals, you could co-present with them, and that's been they can help communicate their interest in that research. And using plain language, lots of pictures, and really just getting into what was the question that was asked and what is the answer to that, being as clear as possible. Graphs are good and maps, but as long as they're well labeled and clear to how they relate to the original question. So that's all that I was going to share with what we do in my work, and I welcome any additional questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Amy. Jean, let's turn it directly over to you. Come a little south of the Arctic Circle and to Tulit'a.
Thanks. Thanks, Amy, for sharing, and thank you for having me at this conference. I'm a Liber Post-doctoral fellow that's administered through Trent University, but I currently live in Tulit'a. So if you go to the second slide, Tulit'a is part of the Sahtu region. So I'm just south of where Amy is calling in from. Inuvik is on this map as well. And the Sahtu region is a land claim settlement area with 5 communities currently. For my PhD research, I worked in collaboration with Dene and Métis people in the Sahtu communities to understand the population structure of caribou through a combination of population genetics and the knowledge and language that Dene people have about caribou. So I have lived and worked in Tulit'a for the last about 5 years, which is a small community of about 500 people. Research in the north can be especially challenging because of, as Roger said, we can be careful with this term, but we are remote and here's the context behind that. We're remote in a physical sense. Through this theme of sustainability can make it very expensive to do research in the north because of all the fossil fuels needed. So Tulit'a and the other 5 Sahtu communities are only accessed by plane in the summer or by boat on the rivers and winter ice roads for 3 months of the year. There's a picture of how you can travel here in the winter, but only when we have really thick ice and snow. ʻełexe Egha means learning together in Dene language. It has been a theme of our research approach and the research approach I took for my PhD research. It's been one of the most important parts of my research has been working in collaboration to understand Dene language and traditional knowledge about caribou. And the involvement of local people is really essential to successful research in the North, as Amy was talking about as well. The people pictured here are just a few of those who have provided much needed expertise for our research. And through discussions with these people and many others about research requirements, we developed a collaborative approach to explore research questions about caribou variation and populations using the best available methods from traditional knowledge and non-invasive population genetics. The way that we prioritize Așehe Egha, or learning together, in our community collaborative approach was to help develop culturally respectful and sustainable research. And to do that, we first partnered with the local Älvsjö Egha, which is the SA2 Renewable Resources Board, which is analogous to the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board that Amy works for. And then also the Älvsjö Egha, which are the local community level institutions that inform wildlife research and monitoring. We also engaged in community-based data collection. So in my research, we had people go out and collect caribou scat or poop samples for our population genetic work, as well as sharing their knowledge and language and long history of relationships with caribou. And then we also held knowledge sharing meetings to bring the results back to the communities and help interpret the genetic results. In kind of thinking about how our approach is build sustainability, especially in a northern context, the first component where we partner with local institutions, I think this really does build sustainability because it helps increase the relevancy of the research by focusing on the questions and issues that are most directly applicable to people's lives. And then also working with organizations like the Gwich'in Renewable Resources Board or the SA2 Renewable Resources Board helps us tie our research into existing research projects, and that dramatically improves effectiveness and efficiency. So we often have many different researchers from many different fields doing different kind of projects in the North. And one of the problems is that there's often we can make mistakes by repeating research over and over, especially when working with community members who have limited time and resources to engage with all of these different researchers. So when you partner with an institution that helps govern and provide support for research projects, it can help really improve efficiency. Like meetings could be shared. If somebody else is working on caribou, I could also be involved, and you can tie things together. And that's made a big difference in my research. The community-based data collection, this also helped improve sustainability because we had our data collection where people collected the caribou samples for us. That was part of their daily livelihoods, going out on the land, on skidoos, traveling on the land. They were able to help us collect samples. And that decreased our reliance on helicopter trips or fossil fuels, and also helped support the local economy and help get people on the land doing things that are part of their traditional livelihoods. And at the same time, since people are out doing this work, it helps improve our understanding of the ecological relationships. And then the knowledge sharing meetings, I think, are critical. And I think one big step that I made in my research was the fact that I ended up living in Tulit'a. I have my family here. And by doing this, the sustainability goal here is to build local research capacity so that researchers from Southern institutions do not have to continually fly in to do the research, but instead local local people from the communities, starting through high school and on up, can ask questions and design research that they want answered and find ways to do it themselves. So that would be our long-term goal. When I really am reflecting on sustainability, I think that for research, especially in the North, to be sustainable, it needs to be interdisciplinary. And that's what I think ʻełexe Egha means. It means bringing multiple different perspectives together to learn together and find ways that those perspectives can increase our knowledge about the world. And it's embracing those synergies, sometimes the differences in perspectives that come from diverse understandings of the world. And I hope that through my career, I can continue to assist building capacity within local communities so that new questions can be developed by the people who are most familiar with the issues that their regions are facing. And that's especially true with conservation, with the issues we're facing with climate change, development, and lots of different industrial changes that are happening in the North. So with that, I just have 2 more slides that are just thank you, because the work I've done has been dependent on so many different people. So Mafi Cho, thank you so much, and I look forward to fielding questions as we go forward.
Great, thank you. There was a very interesting convergence that I thought about as I heard both of your presentations, and that's that while for the time being there's going to be some jet fuel burned in the kind of research you are involved in and facilitating, but that researchers really ought to be consciously thinking, Southern researchers, that they are working themselves, if not out of a job, then at least out of a reliance on the kind of travel that has been the backbone of a certain kind of research in the North, through training local collaborators, through more active research partnerships. So very interesting, I think, coalescing of the points that you made. I'm wondering whether each of you wants to pick up on something the other has said to this point, or just to further any of those points.
This is Jean. My thought on that is that I definitely hope I'm working myself out of a job in the North. I really do hope that in the future it will be a Dene or Métis or local person from the communities who goes on to have a job like mine, doing research on caribou or other wildlife or other renewable resource issues in the North. And that's what I've always told people in meetings I hold with them, and definitely my hope for research in the North. And I think it's possible. Amy talked about the increase in social media and the connectedness of our world is probably opening some opportunities for young people in communities in the North that didn't exist before. And I think there still needs to be a lot more support for that kind of education and really creative ways that young people can be educated. But I'm pretty hopeful.
Amy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I enjoyed listening to Jean's presentation, and I respect that what she is talking about, especially with respect to capacity building and working with research that's directly of interest to community members, and then trying to look at ways to pass it on. Something that came to my mind during her talk is a lot of the work that my office does, as well as me personally, is with youth and trying to encourage them to consider careers in this field. I know there are quite a few of our young people that are doing post-secondary education. My observation is that less of them are choosing to do sciences, and I'm not sure why, but one thing that I do every June is I go into the schools and try to encourage them to consider science as a career path, and I try to make it connected to capture their interest by relating it to the things that I see that they're already doing. I have 2 teenagers at home, and I know just from that they really enjoy being out on the land. They like going hunting and fishing, driving boats, skidoos, and those types of things. And I try to relate that if you're interested in those things and being out on the land, that there is a career that could help you do those types of things through work. And hopefully we'll start seeing more people choosing that path, and then they could be local researchers from here helping from that perspective too.
Thanks. So I'll remind those of you who are participating through various digital means that you are welcome to post questions or comments either on the website, on Twitter, on YouTube, and in that way have a chance to be involved directly in the conversation. I'd like to maybe ask Amy and Jean in your respective roles where you have experienced sustainability to be most challenging, even in terms of your own aspirations for sustainability, your own practices. Where's the challenge?
This is Jean. One of the places I know that I have a much larger impact as far as my fossil fuel use and an impact on the environment, which is difficult as a conservationist, is my travel. And the way that our academic system is still set up, we have to attend conferences. And I think that's one of the main points of this conference is no travel was required from me this time. But to attend other conferences, I have to do much more travel than other people who live in southern Canada, for example, or the continental U.S. It takes a lot of effort to travel to the north, travel around the north, and even just, for example, holding a meeting, if we want to include community members from across the Sahtu, that's a lot of airtime for each community member to travel to wherever our central location will be for the meeting. We do try and hold lots of meetings in the winter, but so does everybody because then you can drive on the winter roads. So the winter becomes a really busy time for holding meetings and people's travel, but it is a challenge in the north. And I also think that we're still lacking in our connectivity with internet speeds, and those should be dramatically improved to help reduce some of those costs to the environment as far as like using fossil fuels to connect people. And I think for me, it's hard. And being in the north, I think we see that a lot, and we kind of might get a little bit too used to how much travel people do to attend meetings.
Thank you. Amy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with what Jean says. Travel is a challenge. It's a challenge for us. We have, our communities are, I think, more accessible than in the Sahtu. We can, at least for most times of the year, be accessible by road, plane, or boat, or ice road. There's only maybe a month or so during breakup or melting time that we're inaccessible, but we're still accessible by plane. To do research, to answer questions, there's still the need for a lot of times helicopter or planes, like to access the locations where our resources are. When I think of sustainability, my first thought is, with my job, is the sustainability of populations. So how to ensure that populations are there for future generations. And there are ways that we can monitor those populations, like I mentioned in my presentation, where there might be more effort and resources and say fossil fuel to do research up front, but then the ultimate goal would be to build capacity in the communities and help them monitor whatever they possibly can. And if we're able to train more of our young people to do that as well and maybe be our future biologists and scientists, then that's also a way. So I'm thinking it's more of a going into the future. And the challenge is that we're not quite there yet in the north, I think. There is a lot of research that's happening with more efficient energy sources for heating our homes. I know that for our office in particular, we went paperless back in 2012, but I still have various levels of board members where some of them still don't really use computers, so we still have to print binders for them. The same with community members. When we go into their community, we try to do presentations through PowerPoint, but we're still needing to print materials for some people, and that works better for some, so we have to work around that as well. For our office, we also, the money that I had mentioned that the board has, that it provides to research projects, it's very limited. It's just they allocate the annual interest from an investment fund. But a few years ago, the board did make a policy change in that, where they have a responsible investment policy now, that they gave direction to our investment managers to not invest money into oil and gas companies that they go against their core values. So that's another thing that our office has tried to do.
So I've been asked to ask each of you, how many hours does it take you and how much does it cost if you were to fly to Edmonton? Maybe this is a way of doing reverse mathematics. If you were here at this event in person, what would it cost you in time and money to be here?
It's Amy travel time. I would have left Inuvik yesterday around 1 o'clock, and I would have flown to Norman Wells and then Yellowknife, and then got into Edmonton around 7 p.m., and then I would have had to get transportation to the hotel, and then would have presented today, and then I would have the only option for me to fly home is to leave tomorrow, and both flights leave at around 7 in the morning, so transportation back to the airport, and then the same route, Edmonton, Yellowknife, Norman Wells, Inuvik, and I would have returned back tomorrow around the same time in noon hour. Cost, I'd say probably somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000. I know that when we go to Yellowknife more often, and I usually say it's around $2,500 to $3,000 for a staff to travel to Yellowknife for a couple-day meeting when you're considering travel, hotel, meals, per diems, and taxi transportation.
This is Jean. Actually, it's pretty similar because Tulit'a, I would either fly to Norman Wells or to Delaunay and then Yellowknife, and then it's the same flights that Amy would take. So usually I could leave at 9:30 in the morning and then get to Edmonton by 7 p.m. And then you'd have to do that the day before and then return. Leaving at 7 a.m. in the morning from Edmonton, I would get back to Tulit'a about 5:30 p.m. And the cost is pretty similar, I think, between $4,000 and $5,000. The small plane flights between the two communities are very, very expensive. So I have to take at least some of those to get to the bigger jet that lands in Norman Wells or to get to Yellowknife. Those cost a lot of money.
Thank you to the person who provided that question in the form of a reality check for this. I was going to say, at least you get a sandwich on the plane.
That's true.
If there was one thing you would wish universities could do in terms of their policies, or maybe research granting agencies in terms of their policies, that would tilt them in that sustainable direction that you've been talking about, what would that change be? Might be cultural, it might be policy. How do we change the trajectory?
This is Jean. One thing that I think dramatically decreased my impact doing my research was the fact that I came to Tulit'a and have lived here. So a lot of research that's done in the north is by fly-in researchers who come for a couple weeks and then fly out, come for a couple weeks, do their research and fly out. And I know that my research has been improved by being here in the community. One, I have more contact with community members, but two, I don't have to fly as much. My research can happen through a much longer time period. It's difficult to tell graduate students that they need to go live in a place that's probably very far away from their families. But if there could be policies that would support graduate students who want to live in the north, that would be really helpful. So things like in the north, usually salaries have a northern living allowance for the increased cost of food and transportation that we see here. And I don't think universities take that into account for graduate student stipends or fellowships or grants. So considering things like that to help support and make it easier for other graduate students to make a decision like I did to actually live in the community where they're doing work. I think that would be amazing.
That's great. It gives a whole different meaning to residency requirements.
Yes, and it wouldn't be for everyone, but maybe make the option available to more people.
Great. Amy,
My response supports what Jean said, and I think it's just stronger encouragement and for building relationships, because I think the stronger you build the relationship, everything else kind of falls in line. So communication, relationships, creating collaboration, I think it makes the research more efficient. It helps answer more questions. I think that can line into what I was talking about before with training and capacity building. It aligns with what Jean's talking about with living in the community. If you live in the community, you're obviously going to be able to make better relationships. I recognize that that's not always a possibility but I think it would be supported. But in lack of that, I think I don't know how you do it, but to just encourage that genuine relationship building and working with people in a meaningful way. And I guess the only other thought that I have is if there's any way that science programs can be more promoted in the North to try and increase that interest of our young people to pursue education, post-secondary education in the sciences, so that we can have more the students that are living in the North now going off to do post-secondary in the science, and then either returning home, or even still, if they don't return home, they're still probably contributing that knowledge base in different means.
Just so before people are teleported to Australia, I want to thank both Amy and Jean for being part of this conference. Well, some of the very good people I've gotten to know, north of 60 in the last few years, and they are, as you will have heard, people of integrity and serious thinking about research and its relationship to community well-being. So thanks both of you, and thanks to all of you who have been part of this in all kinds of ways.
Thank you.
Thank you, Masi Cho.
I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which we're recording this presentation today, the people of the Bunurong, and just across the river their cousins, the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nations, and also to acknowledge and respect the traditional owners of all the lands upon which this video will now be shown. My name's Tiriki Onus. I'm a Yorta and Dja Wurrung man, and I have the great honour of holding the role of lecturer in Indigenous arts and culture here at the Faculty of Fine Arts and Music at the University of Melbourne, and also to be one of our co-directors of our newly launched research unit into Indigenous arts and culture. And I'm joined today with my colleague, Sally Treloyn, my other co-director to the research unit in Indigenous arts and culture.
Thank you, Tiriki. So thanks for having us here today. Really, the rationale for what we're to speak about today is that we believe that Indigenous philosophies of practice need to be taken into account when we think about the sustainability of the academy and the university. We think that the academy has much to gain and learn from Indigenous philosophies of practice, and thus we've set about centering these philosophies of practice in the academy here at the University of Melbourne.
In this image, you'll see an integral part of the foundation of RUIAC. November of 2017, we brought together Indigenous artists, cultural practitioners, and researchers to explore what it would mean to create a research unit founded upon Indigenous epistemologies and approaches to knowledge production and revitalisation. Communities represented from as far away as Western Arnhem Land, Rupert and Renfrew Munro from Warui in the front there, Victorian Aboriginal nations, Tongwurrong, Yorta, Dja Wurrung, people from the Western Kimberley, Torres Strait Islands representatives, and in the centre of the image you'll see carried by Sally and I our biganga, as we say in my language, our possum skin cloak, which was to become our central foundational document for the research unit.
So in thinking towards the objectives and expressing the objectives of our research unit, we really came to the realisation that our fundamental goal is to centre Indigenous philosophies of practice in the academy and to really address front-on the strengths-based approach, defying any deficit model, the challenge of bringing Indigenous expertise into the academy with a view that the academy has much to learn and society has much to learn from technologies and knowledges that have enabled Indigenous peoples to manage in a changing environment for thousands of generations. So in pursuing that super objective, we identified 4 operational objectives, if you like. And these drill down more to the challenge of thinking about what a research unit within a Western institution would look like. So the first of these is to conduct and promote research that produces knowledge about Indigenous arts practices and arts philosophies. At its heart, our research team and research unit has a strong track record in research into arts practices and a developing expertise in really how to penetrate those practices and knowledges into the academy. Our second operational objective is to support and grow Indigenous research and Indigenous researchers in the arts through postgraduate training, research activity, and research networks. And a little way through this presentation, we'll show you a little more about what that research activity and what those networks are, but also briefly outline our postgraduate research training program. Thirdly, to inform and demonstrate world's best practice in intercultural research and research training. So I, as a non-Indigenous person, really want to explore and ensure that my knowledge is shared with others in setting out to work collaboratively and long-term in partnership with Indigenous individuals and organisations and communities. We've found that there's much goodwill in our institution towards engaging with Indigenous communities, Indigenous artists, Indigenous researchers, but there's many barriers to those collaborations being successful.
Absolutely, and I think as part of that, one of the key remits for the research unit that we all hold very dear to our heart is to make sure that our Indigenous communities, and I speak for myself as an Aboriginal man, that our communities become owners of research and research practice ourselves, and that we are seen as equal stakeholders in that, rather than having just been the subject of research for so long, but rather that we are able to control how we are seen, how our voice is given, and we'll talk about using voice more later on, but certainly to see Indigenous communities and Indigenous artists as the agency for their own voice and as the owners of a knowledge system or knowledge systems that stretch back to the very beginning of our time.
And our fourth objective is really to ensure that we have strong networks and strong partnerships with other research units within the university, other teams, other sectors within the university and beyond. And really, we want to do this to leverage the potential of arts knowledges across disciplines and leverage, likewise, the power of the academy in society. And this is really what's also driving our keenness to participate in this forum today with the international audience that we have. So really, to give you some insight into the background or premise for establishing a research unit, we've just outlined a number of points here. And one that across many disciplines, there's growing awareness of the need to shape the design methods and outcomes of research according to Indigenous epistemologies. There's growing awareness, but there's to date little understanding of what that reshaping might actually look like. What are the mechanics of that? How does it work in practice? What are the challenges? What are some of the successes? So our rationale is that arts and arts methodologies can actually provide special access to these Indigenous epistemologies and the power of them. particularly because of the special access that they provide to implicit, embodied, sounded, and otherwise expressed ways of knowing and ways of being that can elude science and text-based disciplines.
And I think we're very fortunate in that regard in where we currently sit as well as RUIAC. Within the Faculty of Fine Arts and Music, we are artists. Our knowledge production is practice-based, and the traditions that exist in our Indigenous cultures in this country stretch back through a lived, embodied, practice-based method of learning and of articulating ourselves in the world and in space. So this idea of perhaps less traditional research outputs and engaging through our practice as artists and as knowledge makers has been incredibly empowering to the process of engaging RUIAC with community and creating a culturally safe space into which people who perhaps in the past have seen the university as being somewhat other or separate or distant to them, creating a space that is culturally safe for people to step into and to feel comfortable in and to feel empowered by.
And so to that end, we really are driven by the fact that collaborative, interdisciplinary research that investigates both explicit or articulated and implicit, as in embodied and performed, Indigenous philosophies of practice in the arts and practice-based research is needed. And that's how we've set forth.
Our current research activity, so we're very engaged not just in conducting our own research in communities as researchers and artists ourselves, but empowering the voice of artists in those communities and helping to create pathways for Indigenous artists, practitioners, cultural practitioners within the broader community to find their own way into research and into the academy. So as part of our core research training, we work with our partner organisation or our parent organisation here, if you will, the Willan Centre for Indigenous Arts and Cultural Development, to offer a graduate research program which we launched in 2016 and have now got a strong cohort of visual artists, theatre makers, musicians, cultural practitioners who are working across a range of extremely high-level art practices here. It is a fine arts institution after all, but who are also deeply ingrained in their indigeneity and their own practice as an Indigenous artist. We support not just our own Masters and PhD students through our MFA and PhD in Indigenous Arts and Culture, but also any Indigenous artist or practitioner who wishes to engage with the other specialisations on offer here at the Faculty of Fine Arts and Music. We have plans for a graduate coursework program which is slowly growing to support further pathways into our RHD and also to enable our community members, our artists, to make the best of themselves, to actually understand what a research degree for them might look like. So graduate research application workshops, dispelling some of the myths around research and a research higher degree and what that might look like. And a holistic approach to supporting our students all the way through, not from a point of deficit, but helping our students to identify the strengths that are inherently there already in their arts practice, in the epistemologies, in the knowledge systems with which they have interacted their entire lives. How we can mentor and provide a personalised retention support to those Indigenous graduate students, not just from here in Australia, but from all over the world. We're very excited to have our first international Masters of Fine Arts and Indigenous Arts and Culture joining us, a lovely First Nations girl from Canada. But how we also support our colleagues and our staff in other areas of our faculty, other disciplines, to engage with Indigenous research and Indigenous research students right across our faculty and indeed across the University of Melbourne and our partners.
Absolutely. I think in surveying the literature around Indigenous student recruitment and retention, major issues emerge around the support systems that need to be in place for students. And we found that through taking this strengths-based approach, looking at the expertise of the student, and really utilising a graduate program to give individualised attention, we found that that's really kind of served to retain students in comparison to a broader survey of some of the issues that hinder participation and graduation.
And indeed, our students are all working and have already been working at incredibly high levels. They come from quite refined artistic practices already, or quite engaged cultural practices in community. And here's just a selection of some of our students. Our very first PhD Indigenous Arts and Culture candidate, Andrew Morumburi Dowding, who's working on Tabi song traditions in the Pilbara in Western Australia. So for those not familiar with the map of Australia, it's a long way from where we currently are in Melbourne, but still very much engaged and grounded in the ethos of Ruiak and the notions of a community engaged practice and a model for Indigenous research that we hope will travel far and wide. John Wayne Parsons, one of our first MFA candidates, I should say, finding Wakai, voice and place, continuing his Yugara and Uga cultural practice here in Melbourne. Yugara and Uga country coming from northern Queensland and the Torres Strait Islands, looking at how we as an incredibly diverse Indigenous peoples collaborate and tell our stories on one another's country, and how do we create new cultural protocols for that to happen. Part of our remit here is to challenge those notions of indigeneity that have perhaps been presented before within broader mainstream Australian education systems as well, and recognise the diversity and the strength that exists in our communities even to this very day. And of course, Carissa Godwin, our new PhD candidate, looking at theatre and ceremony and collaborating across cultures between Indigenous artists and theatre makers and non-Indigenous. Looking at how all of our artists, all of our candidates, looking at how we take our voice, how we present ourselves to the world.
So some of our current activity in terms of research projects, like this is really the area that has been right at the heart and kind of the genesis of our building of our research unit. We've been quite fortunate in our journey and path towards competitive research funding, and many of our students are actually involved in our different funded research projects, kind of in trainee roles as research assistants or on studentships and so on. So perhaps the hallmark project for the research unit is actually right at the bottom there, Artist Voice, Indigenous Epistemologies for Research about Arts and Practice-Based Research. This was actually funded internally through the University of Melbourne at the Chancellery level, and it enabled us to do a lot of the consultation, the thinking, the workshopping required to really set a solid foundation for our research unit and our program. Of particular note there is that we have a strong emphasis and a specialism in issues of sustainability, Indigenous reclamation and revitalisation of cultural practices. And this is both like on the ground, so reclamation and revitalisation of song and dance practices through intergenerational knowledge transmission, reclamation, mining data from archives, Indigenous peoples reclaiming knowledge from archives, but then also thinking about sustainability in terms of how access to digital collections of song, language, photographs, documents can be managed and achieved by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous stakeholders in those records. And that area is really where much of our traditional research specialism and where we're recognised as experts. Of particular note in this list is also a project that we're involved in that's funded by the Canadian Research Council, the SHIRK program, a partnership development grant that we hold with York University called Connecting Culture and Childhood, Implications of the Repatriation of Archival Recordings for Children and Young People. And this is really looking at youth-led initiatives around repatriated recordings in Australia, in Canada, in South Africa, and Uganda. So quite an exciting project that both Tiriki and I are involved in.
And here's some of our approach when we finally brought together so many of the different threads and communities with which we've been working and talking for so long about this need, this desire to have a research unit that represented our voice. We began with, I think in the end we had something like 20 different Aboriginal nations or communities represented. Some of those double, some of us are multiple claimers and draw our ancestry back to several different nations. However, across our cohort, our group that came together for our week in November, we had children, young people, all of them arts practitioners, cultural mentors and authorities in their own communities, sharing knowledge, sharing stories. And we began this whole week really just with the question, how do we want to represent ourselves? How do we want to be represented? We created song together, we created ceremony together, and we talked about the huge diversity that exists within our cultural practices and how we could still work with these in a similar space, acknowledging that we are all Aboriginal people, but we come from vastly different cultural backgrounds in many senses. Prior to invasion, there were over 300 Aboriginal tribes, nations, and language groups here in this country, each of us with our own cultural identity, and finding a space in which we could articulate that nuance and find that voice and celebrate in that diversity was incredibly important and central, I think, to all of us.
Absolutely. And I think what these workshops and just these snapshots here really demonstrate is the way in which participants were really able to use their own practice and their philosophy of their practice to penetrate and influence the academy. Rather than it having like that philosophy or those beliefs having to be framed in terms of a particular narrative structure or particular form. So we were able to support youth-led initiatives, youth from one part of Australia teaching youth from another, and really looking at the role that young people play in keeping knowledges strong and sustaining knowledges over time. We saw sharing of culture and practices across groups and in a way hoping to valorize and elevate traditions of ceremonial exchange and diplomacy that go back thousands of generations, but bringing them into the academy today in a way that's not been previously achieved.
And here we are. Well, our core group, as I say, we are much bigger with all of our participants, and we do take in over 20 different Aboriginal nations. However, Sally and I, as you've already met via this video at the front, our advisor and head of the Willan Centre, Richard Franklin, Associate Professor Richard J. Franklin. We're very excited to have our first Mackenzie Post-doctoral Fellow, Dr. Lou Bennett, on board with us now, researching, reclaiming and repatriating Djatjawurrung language, culture and song to our communities here in central Victoria. Postdoctoral Research Fellow and Coordinator of our graduate programs, Dr. Ruben Brown, and I love this title, our Community Technologist, Jared Kuvan, who is responsible for not only gathering so much of the data, but making all of the magic of computers work for us. And a mysterious administrative assistant.
Applications are being taken now. So this brings us to our inaugural symposium called Philosophies of Practice, a symposium on Indigenous arts and culture practice and research. We had this in November of last year hosted by the Willan Centre for Indigenous Arts and Cultural Development. And really this symposium came at the end of a week of workshops of people really sharing knowledge, exploring what it meant to have that knowledge in the academy, what's possible from that, what are the risks, what are the concerns, and how can we actually have a symposium in a form that really pays respect to the modes of participation and knowledge production that the communities had brought to us so generously. And so we began it all with a registration process, as many symposiums begin with, but as well as kind of like the traditional institutional writing names down and name tags and so on. We also embraced a Indigenous form of registration, of participation in an event and participation in a ceremony, and that is inscribing a registration on faces. So literally painting marks on faces, and key members of the participant team took this on. And here we see Emily Ford, a Rukrak Maranangal young woman from near Darwin in the Northern Territory, inscribing the director of the Victorian College of the Arts, in which the faculty in which we sit, with a registration on the opening day.
And our presentations have covered a whole range of different fora, different conversations. Particularly important to us was the concept of youth perspectives and their practices in Indigenous art, seeing our young artists as viable and indeed incredibly vital artists and cultural practitioners and contributors to our research and our community in general, but also as being integral to the process of continuing culture. Those who are going to take these stories on, those who are currently being asked really to step up and to make their voices heard. It was extraordinary to have such a wide representation from across so many different communities. I don't believe I've ever seen a forum which covered such a large geographic space, certainly in the country, but to see so many young artists and practitioners, many of whom still in their teens, coming together, finding this voice and seeing the legitimacy of their voice in an institution such as this was something of an extraordinary sight to behold.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in the panel before this session, we actually had the elders, so many of whom were elders of the same family groups that these young people come from, talking about their experience and their needs of the academy and their own practice and for their youth. The final panel that we had during the symposium was really thinking about wise practice for academies, but also for communities in engagement with academies. So what can we learn from Indigenous arts practitioners, and from past research relationships as we move forwards to what we hope is a productive and culturally safe research unit and research culture moving forward. So here we've really brought together some of the senior proponents of ethnomusicology in Australia, Emeritus Professor Alan Marrett there, from Sydney University, who's worked for many decades in the north of Australia, Professor Linda Barwick from Sydney University, Dr. Pai Linda Ford, a senior research fellow from Charles Darwin University, and a leader of research in looking at new ways for old songs. So bringing ceremonial practice and records of ceremonial practice into the academy and into archives in culturally safe ways. As well as Wayne Atkinson there, who's a senior Indigenous member of Melbourne University, and with much experience to add.
Well, probably one of our first Indigenous academics, a real trailblazer, Dr. Wayne Atkinson, to try to create, or a man who did create a space for Indigenous knowledges here within the University of Melbourne, embracing oral history traditions and recognising the importance of story and of narrative to our communities and ways in which we can bring these stories together to celebrate them and to share them and then disseminate them again throughout our community.
Yeah, and one of the important things, or perhaps different things about this symposium that made it quite effective and that ensured participation right throughout was that we had set up at the back a working station where people could continue their creative practice throughout the sessions with wood burners, with stitching, with carving, and other practices. And what this meant is that young people could continue to participate whilst talking was going on, and vice versa. Elders would be at the back while young people were talking and so on. And it just basically turned the symposium space into a very participatory space where one form of communication and knowledge production wasn't being privileged over any other. And that's certainly something that we'd like to continue moving forwards.
And this is what our symposium really led us to. This, as you saw the photo from the very start, the launch of our research unit. We'd spent the week talking business, talking country, discussing and laying out our connections and our responsibilities to one another, and all culminating with this final ceremonial performance where each different language group, each group of performers took on the mantle to sing the story of Ruiak, to sing the story of their country, and to sing into our biganga, our possum cloak, as we led it through the campus. An active diplomacy of each different nation taking on responsibilities of singing at different points, all carefully orchestrated throughout the week, but ultimately being integral to our identity, not just as Indigenous artists, but as Indigenous researchers, as producers of knowledge, and those in so doing, creating a connection, a responsibility between all of us for that one huge piece of ceremony that we all are now stakeholders and owners of to one degree or other. And so our ceremony ultimately culminates after our procession that took quite some time. Once everyone had gotten to have the sing that and tell the story and bring in the diversity of voice that we were so impassioned by, we ended by finally launching our research units, showing our output, singing, carving and weaving, dancing our partnerships into the university with one another. A relational accountability set up between each and every one of us who took part in that ceremony. In the top left-hand corner there, you can see Rupert Munralur presenting the Dean of our faculty, Barry Cunningham, with ceremonial clapsticks that were created throughout the week and used in all of our ceremony. All of these objects that were to become our foundational documents presented to the Dean, below that to Richard Franklin, the head of the Willans Centre, to the university in general, as legitimate binding contracts between all of us and between the academy itself, creating space for Ruiak, and more importantly, creating vital connections for our community, but also for our non-Indigenous colleagues to connect, to have a pathway into Indigenous communities that were Indigenous controlled and led, that created culturally safe structures for us to come together to share culture and practice and to revitalise and keep our stories going. And this ultimately was our final central document. Some of us still have to put our designs on our panels, Sally. But our biganga, or in local language here, wallet, our possum cloak, a system of knowledge that has existed here in this country for thousands upon thousands of generations. Our cloaks were presented to us as babies, the first thing we do is wrap our babies in our possum cloaks, and inside would be incised all the stories of our country for which we were responsible. And as we grew, our cloaks grow with us, and we add our stories to the inside of that cloak. When it comes time for ceremony, we turn our cloaks inside out, and we dance our ceremony. Our women turn them into drums, and to drive our ceremony. They're the keepers of our song. And as we walk through that ceremony ground, as we walk through community, wearing our cloaks inside out, if you will, with all of our stories on the outside, everyone sees us as the women and the men of high degree that we are, the stories for which we are responsible in handing on to the next generation of giving life to. And ultimately, one day when we die, the cloak becomes our funeral shroud. It is the one most tangible piece of cultural expression to Aboriginal people here in the southeast of Australia that follows us through our entire lives. And as it was, we could see no more appropriate object in which to vest so many of our stories than in this bigunga, in this cloak.
So moving forwards, as a research unit, we're in our early days. We're crystallising our themes, our nodes, our networks, but founded, as you've seen, in real life, practicing philosophies of practice and arts, and reflecting at all times on that cloak, what's on it, how it's made, and what binds it together, where it's come from. We're moving towards into our website and communications. You should see a site go live within a couple of weeks. We can continue to work towards our planning for our next series of workshops and symposia, expanding our networks, expanding inclusion, hoping eventually to build international involvement in that as well. We pursue seminars and joint public seminars with other research units and centres within the university. And of course, we continue to focus on our RHD, our Research Higher Degree Postgraduate Training Program, and really fostering that cohort and strengthening that cohort to be the researchers and research leaders of the future. Undoubtedly, we will continue to focus on our project work and funding bids, always responding to the needs, desires, wants, priorities identified in those workshops and symposia. And of course, we also pay special attention to what we refer to as in the university system as non-traditional research outputs. How do we do justice to documenting our cloaks, our artwork, our performances as research outputs? It's not just the monograph, it's also the artistic products, and it's also the long-term engagements that between people of different nations that need to be recognised as the outputs of research. And then, of course, going forwards, we are strategising to secure institutional support and funding to support the sustainability of the unit and our activity, more importantly, into the future. I believe...
And that's us.
That's us. Whilst we're not there in person to receive questions or live online to receive questions, we'd be very happy to receive any by email or other modes of communication going forward. So thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely.
Well, I would like to thank our colleagues from the Research Unit for Indigenous Arts and Cultures at the University of Melbourne. And now to help us close up, I'd like to introduce Dean Leslie Cormack of the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. I'm delighted to be here to bring greetings, if you will, from the University of Alberta and to thank Geoffrey and his team for all the work that they have done and are doing to make sure that this Sustainable Research Conference is a success. It's really quite astonishing to think of the participation that we have from Northern Canada through to Australia, all over the world, and to think of how we can do this in a way that limits our footprint but doesn't limit our connections and conversations. So congratulations to everyone, and best wishes for a great conference to come.
I'm going to just say a final word to remind you of what's coming on tomorrow. We have a fabulous session tomorrow on art and in the Anthropocene, a debate on sustainability and ecology. This is going to be co-chaired by our colleagues Natalie Lovelace and Jesse Bayer, who are going to introduce a number of artists, researchers, and some prepared work. So it's going to be a very different sort of talk tomorrow. And it starts at noon Mountain Time, so set your clocks, and we hope you'll join us. Thank you very much.